This case is reconstructed from Alexander McGregor's account in The Law Killers, also David Leslie's correspondence with Robert Mone in his book Carstairs, as well as newspaper articles and archival court registries. McGregor depicts Mone as a volatile, raging lunatic, where Leslie presents him through his own words, detached, self-pitying, and shifting blame entirely onto McCulloch. The objective truth almost certainly lies somewhere in the middle. The story begins in Dundee, June 1948, with the birth of Robert Francis Mone. From the start, he was a chaotic, volatile presence, so much so that one former teacher later described having him in class as akin to being in the room with a live hand grenade. Isolated and aggressive, he spent his childhood unable to form or maintain relationships, save for one notable exception we'll get to later. By 15, after 3 turbulent years at St. John's, he was expelled, leaving behind allegations that he had been raped by a member of the staff. Thereafter, he was shipped off to an approved school in London, remaining there until the age of 18, where he finally joined the army, a desperate attempt to escape a deeply dysfunctional home life that had already broken him. His stint in the army was disastrous. He found himself being physically threatened by his peers and seniors, so much so that he separated from them and told he'd be sent back to the UK. Feeling dejected, disappointed, and depressed, he leaves Germany and returns to the UK absent without leave. He goes to London first, where he buys a single-barrel, 12-gauge shotgun. He wanted to saw the barrel off and go back to Germany, but decides instead to go to Dundee, where he visits his dad. The two of them get into a blowout argument that turns physical. He considers shooting his father, but he's stopped from doing so by his grandmother. Had he done so, the series of events that robbed no less than 7 people of their lives might never have happened. Mone laments on this in the book Carstairs, saying he wished he had killed him. October 1967. Mone is now drinking all day, every day, from breakfast to last orders at the pubs. Becoming increasingly more depressed, he decides to end his own life. He visits various doctors and accumulates an amount of pain medications for the purpose, but ultimately doesn't succeed. He'd frequently visit medical professionals for help with his depression. He's repeatedly dismissed and told his problems will just disappear. Unsurprisingly, they don't. November 1967, All Saints' Day. Dressed in his army uniform, the 18-year-old spends the day drinking at the White Horse Inn, directly across from his old school, St. John's. His dejection, dissatisfaction, and disenfranchisement begins to boil over. In his own hauntingly self-aware words, self-pitying and self-absorbed, I was blind to the worth of other people. In ostracizing myself from others, seeing in them only hurtful persecutors, I lost all empathy for them. And by diminishing myself, I inevitably diminished them. He decides to go back to the hotel to get his things and return to the army to deal with the fallout. He waits for a taxi in the pouring rain. One never shows up. His resolve weakens, and while waiting outside the pub looking at his old school, buried resentments and angers begin to fill his head. He walks back to the hotel, wraps the gun in a sheet of brown paper, and returns to St. John's. On the top floor of the building, Lynette Hansen, aged 26, is teaching a needlework class to 12 third-year girls. She'd been married not 6 months prior and had moved to Dundee for her husband's work opportunity. Mone enters the building and heads up the stairs, looking to find a substitute for the true targets of his rage. The first room he enters is empty. The next one, sadly, is not. He opens the door and steps inside, tearing the paper off the gun. One of the girls laughs at him, thinking he's playing a prank. The reaction angers him, and he begins threatening them and waving the weapon around. The girls are terrified, but Nanette remains calm, smiling, and tries to defuse the situation, to no avail. While laying out ammunition on the teacher's desk, he instructs the girls to barricade the door using their desks and cover the broken window with fabric. He points the weapon at their heads from time to time if they cried too loud and asks each of them how old they are. Some are frozen with fear, others comply with his requests. When he asks Nanette, she tells him 26. He tells her, "You're just a pensioner," before knocking her glasses to the floor and crushing them with his boot. He orders the girls into a small changing room attached to the classroom, explaining to them that he desired revenge on the teacher who had abused him, and against the school itself for expelling him. Nanette remains calm. She tries to convince Mone to let the girls go and keep her as a hostage, but he refuses. It's not long before police arrive. Sirens blaring, lights flashing. They first work to evacuate the some 1,000 pupils present that day and cordon off the building. A squad bearing riot shields and weapons heads directly to Mone's location. Police officers follow behind them and plan to negotiate with Mone for the safety of the hostages, but as they arrive at the barricaded door, Mone spots them and unloads shots through the door. Lacking good visibility, they retreat down the hallway. They try to reason with him through the door, but he insists that any attempt at entry will result in him shooting the girls. He points a gun at one of their heads and sends her to stand at the door as a human shield. By this point, he's far more agitated and irrational. He aims the gun towards the changing room, ordering 3 of the girls to come to him. He kisses one and interferes with the other 2. Feeling emboldened by his control over the situation, he decides to release one of the girls, who flees down the hallway to the officers waiting outside, who interrogate her for information about the unfolding scenario. She relays the events, a description of Mone, and tells them that he has a shotgun. The officers outside begin to call out to Mone again, trying to establish a conversation with him. He yells back, telling them he'll only speak to Marion Young, a girl he knew 4 years prior from near where he lived in his childhood home, the closest thing he ever had to a real friend. The police quickly contact her, and shortly later, the 18-year-old student nurse arrives on scene. She's given a brief rundown of the situation and insists on entering the room to speak with Mone. Initially, the police refuse, but seeing no alternative to defuse the situation peacefully, they agree. She makes her way up the stairs and calls out. He moves the barricade to let her in, and then barks an order at the girls to build it back up. He's washed his face and hair in one of the sinks in preparation for her arrival. When she arrives, he tells her, "How did you know I wouldn't blow your head off?" She tells him he knew he wouldn't hurt her. Marion and Nanette both keep attempting to convince Mone to let the girls go. Reluctantly, he agrees, and motions to the changing room. Nanette ushers the girls out and toward the door, but as she's about to leave, he calls out to her, "Not you," and summons her back into the room. He doesn't calm down after this. He remains agitated, restless, and still brimming with rage. He produces some squashed sandwiches from his pocket, offering some to Marion, but demanding cigarettes from Nanette. While eating his sandwich, he puts the gun down on the desk. Marion, who's standing nearby, picks it up, not to raise it against him, simply to inspect it. Mone lunges out, raining blows on her, and seizes the weapon back. He begins waving it around again, pointing it at the women, the doors, the windows. He taunts Marion with the weapon and asks, "Do you think I can do it?" He aims at the roof, pulls the trigger, but the gun doesn't fire. He points it back at Nanette. "Do you want to be a saint?" The gun fails to go off again. Movement at the door compels him to pivot around and shoot at the door. The weapon discharges. He begins to curse those who sold him the gun. He points the weapon at Marion once more. She tells him, "You won't do anything anyway." Her words remind him of the failure and futility in his life. A police sniper claimed years later that he had a clear shot on Mone by now, but was never given the order to shoot. Mone tells Nanette to turn around and shut the window blinds, and he shoots her in the back. The young woman collapses to the floor, mortally wounded but still alive. Marion rushes over, checks for a pulse. It's faint, but present. She begs Mone to get Nanette some help, and he dismissively agrees. Paramedics and 2 of the school staff enter the room behind shotgun shields. One of these men is the individual Mone had claimed was connected with the trauma he experienced as a youth. He ignores all of them, singing and talking to himself while sat on the desk, shotgun now sitting loose in his lap. They remove Nanette, and once the room is cleared, police release dogs into the room to subdue him and rush in behind them. He puts up no resistance as they cuff him and drag him off the Bell Street police station, beating him as they lead him to the van. Mone still doesn't resist, doesn't say a word. Nanette would succumb to her injuries a few hours later. After her passing, they discover she was pregnant. She'd be awarded the Albert Medal for Bravery posthumously. Her calm demeanor and cool head saved the lives of the children in her class. Marion would receive her own honours, being awarded the George Medal. Before his court date, Mone's interviewed by psychiatrists in jail who diagnose him with schizophrenia and deem him unfit to plead. At his hearing, which lasts less than 18 minutes, the judge orders him to indefinite detainment at Carstairs High Security State Hospital. Mone responds by telling him, "Good for you." He's never convicted of Nanette's death. 2 years after he arrives at Carstairs, Mone makes a new friend and lover in a young man named Thomas McCulloch. The 2 of them would go on to dramatically outdo the violence of the school siege. Thomas Neil McCulloch, a clinically diagnosed psychopath with a history of violence and addiction issues, found himself at Carstairs following a brutal, unprovoked shooting. In May 1970, McCulloch goes to his local, the Erskine Bridge Motel in Clydebank. He orders his usual drink and a sandwich. When it's put in front of him, he examines it for a couple of seconds and then begins loudly complaining that there wasn't enough butter. Staff assure him that the amount of butter used is normal. McCulloch leaves the establishment muttering profanities under his breath. He returns to his home where he'd been gathering an arsenal of assault rifles, shotguns, and handguns. He records himself on a small portable tape recorder, rambling about how he's going to return there and kill everyone before picking up a revolver, a bandolier with shotgun shells, and 2 shotguns. When McCulloch returns to the bar, he makes a beeline for the kitchen and begins yelling, calling out the cook John Thompson by name. Worried staff and customers try to talk him down, but as the cook turns around the corner to see what the commotion is, McCulloch raises the weapon and shoots him in the face, seriously wounding but thankfully not killing him. McCulloch then roams around the rest of the hotel, emptying rounds through closed doors, one of which injures the motel manager, Lilius Roger. He continues threatening whoever he comes across and claims he intends to take a table full of patrons hostage. Police arrive less than an hour after the first shot was fired and they surround the building. One officer enters through the front to negotiate with McCulloch, who is now hiding behind one of the lounge tables he's overturned. Two other officers sneak into the back of the motel while he's distracted by the first one. They tackle him to the ground and disarm him. No lives are lost as a result. Much like Mone, McCulloch is deemed unfit to plead and sentenced to indefinite detainment in Carstairs. Mone claimed McCulloch told him that the attack had nothing to do with the sandwich, but that a man staying at the hotel had made an advance on him. McCulloch had previously visited psychologists concerned about his homosexual tendencies. The advance had played on his insecurity, and his intention was to kill the individual, multiple motel guests, and then to die in a shootout with police. Mone would also claim that McCulloch's failure to kill anyone would be a perverse source of deep shame and humiliation during his stay at Carstairs. By all outward measures, McCulloch was the perfect inmate, polite, well-spoken, and fully engaged in various activities and groups in the hospital, behaviour that would lead staff to grant him ground parole status. Mone, similarly, gains some qualifications and attends the same groups and gatherings as McCulloch, but remains obtuse, uncaring, and argumentative. The institution fails to see the danger brewing entirely. Carstairs, however, was a wretched place, one which would, in later years, face deep scrutiny over allegations of unchecked systemic and lateral abuse, both patient on patient and staff on patient. It would be decades before any of this was made public, and to this day there's never been a standalone public inquiry into the exploitation and physical abuse of young male and female patients at Carstairs. Despite it being well known at this point, it took until 2015 for the General Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry to even look into it at all. To anyone outside, it was a safe and contained institution devoted to rehabilitation and care. To those inside, it was anything but. Ironically, Mone was one of the people responsible for making any of this public at all. Numerous times he reported this to the police. When police investigated his claims in 2013, they confirmed his reports and determined that no further criminal action could be taken. When Mone first alerted the authorities to this in 1973, he claims he was threatened by senior members of staff and had privileges revoked as a result, which prevented him from finishing his law degree. Mone also claimed that at least one member of staff was responsible for the distribution of CSAN inside the hospital, and that he himself was abused by another patient. On at least one occasion, Carstairs even opened its doors to Jimmy Savile. A landmark study starting in 1992 and published in 2020, which followed 241 patients in Carstairs, found that the average life expectancy for those patients was 24 years shorter for the women and about 15 years shorter for the men. Of the 89 patients who died during the study, 63 of those deaths were premature. The overall suicide rate in that group was significantly lower than the average for institutions such as these though, accounting for just 5 of the deaths. After being downgraded for speaking out against the hospital, Mone is approached by McCulloch, who moves into his dorm with him. He teaches him to make soft toys, and this hobby occupies many of their early nights together. In turn, Mone teaches him what he knew of law from his abruptly ended studies. Having had so much difficulty over the years with relationships of all kinds, he finds himself captivated by McCulloch's singular attention, especially given his notable contempt for so many others within the hospital itself. It isn't long before the two become lovers, with McCulloch going as far as making a doll of Mone that he kept in his bed. He'd also dressed them in matching outfits. In private, Mone said that McCulloch would continue to express a preoccupation with what he termed acts of urban terrorism, as if somehow to redeem his failure at Erskine Bridge Hotel. Sometime later, Mone is transferred to a different ward, away from McCulloch, and becomes more engaged with healthier and productive activities in the hospital, such as writing for the hospital magazine, The State Observer, and becoming a peer tutor in the hospital's education centre. A senior doctor at the hospital encourages him to become involved with the hospital's dramatic society, writing one-act plays for the patients to perform, as well as heading up the group, and begins to see his good behaviour find traction. Eventually, the option of a transfer to a lower security facility back in Dundee becomes a possibility, something he has mixed feelings about because such a return would place him back within the sphere of influence of a family he hated. McCulloch played on this concern to convince him that his efforts at rehabilitation would be for naught. In the summer of 1976, Mone claims that McCulloch revealed to him a large stash of plasticine key impressions he'd taken of staff keys in the woodworking unit, a homemade hatchet, a handful of daggers, a pair of garrotes, the blade of a sword, and a long-weighted rope ladder. McCulloch had been taking materials from the metalworking supplies for the blades and making the handles in the woodworking unit. Mone claims that McCulloch was so ingratiated amongst the staff that he was able to carry the weapons through the hospital in a box to sharpen them, and was never challenged to show the contents to anyone. His demeanour around Mone seems to deteriorate, and he becomes fixated on escape and murder, continuing to pull Mone deeper into his influence. Alongside the cache of weapons, the two of them fashion fake IDs and steal fake moustaches and nurses' caps from the drama costume supply. They convince visitors to provide them with money, maps, and a flashlight. For 6 months, they accumulate all the items they would need to break out, until late in the evening of the 30th of November 1976, they set their plans in motion. McCulloch wears a makeshift belt carrying an axe and 3 knives, while Mone conceals knives in his pockets and shirt. He also has a container of paint stripper he intends to use to blind people. Nursing officer Neil McClellan and patient Ian Simpson, himself a double murderer, are having a conversation in a small office while the pair of would-be escapees are in a room across the hall gearing up for their assault. McCulloch orders Mone to disable Neil, and the two men make their way to the nursing office. Mone throws the paint stripper in Neil's face, while McCulloch begins swinging the hatchet at Ian. The attack is so savage that pieces of his skull would later be found in his clothing. Both men struggle with Ian for a few moments before he drops to the floor, bleeding profusely. In the fray, Neil manages to make a dash for the door, but McCulloch chases him into the hallway. Ian reaches for a knife that's fallen to the floor. Mone grabs a pitchfork and buries it in his back. Upon looking into the hall, he sees Thomas straddling Neil, swinging the hatchet from above repeatedly. McCulloch yells at Mone to help him, but he remains in the office. When McCulloch is done, he smacks his accomplice in the head with the butt of the hatchet for his inaction, drawing blood. The pair then move to a telecoms box where they cut the phone lines. McCulloch says he needs to go back to get the keys to the drama room from the office. However, those doors are already open. He re-emerges a few minutes later, soaked in gore, wielding a fire axe and with Ian's ears in his pocket. They don their disguises and leave the building. The alarm that sounded for their escape didn't ring for a full 40 minutes, until after they had departed. The two rush into the yard outside, where they throw a blanket over the barbed wire fence and hurl the rope ladder across it. Mone is the first over, and takes the weapons through the bars before McCulloch scales them to join him. When they get to the road, he tells Mone to lie down and pretend to be injured, hoping to bait a passing car into stopping. It isn't long before one stops, and the driver gets out to help. By complete coincidence, and before the man can get close to them, a police vehicle arrives. It pulls over, and PC George Taylor steps out to investigate. Mone raises the axe as a warning, and George tries to disarm him. The two struggle while McCulloch attempts to disable PC John Gillies in the car, who is attempting a radio for backup. George liberates the axe from Mone's grip, but the moment he does, he's tackled to the ground by the other man and stabbed. John flees the police vehicle and runs down the road, while George stumbles away towards the hospital, fatally wounded. The escapees take the police car, making it only 10 miles before skidding on ice and veering into a ditch. Mone is hurled against the windshield and knocked out briefly. When he comes to, McCulloch is talking to 2 men who had stopped their van to assist the crashed vehicle. By the time they get close, Mone is recovered and is on his feet. The 2 men attack the would-be Samaritans, with Mone stabbing one of them in the chest 7 times before both of them are bundled into the back of their own van. The 2 don't make it far before the new vehicle's in a ditch again. Bogged down and unable to move, they flee the vehicle, heading in the direction of a farmhouse with lights on. Halfway there, the way is blocked by a waist-high river. While crossing it, Mone loses his footing, but McCulloch makes it completely across. Mone calls out for help. His partner observes him for several minutes before finally offering the hill of the axe to pull him to the other side. They arrive at the door, soaked in blood and mud, and push past to get inside. After ripping the phone off the wall, they demand the keys to the car outside. Both men get into the car and take off toward Carlisle, the reckless driving having attracted the attention of a police vehicle now in pursuit. As they near a roundabout, the vehicle's rammed by one of the police cars, launching the car up over a grass embankment and down into a meadow on the other side. They immediately flee the 3rd vehicle and set upon a 4th. Forcing the driver out, he takes the keys from the ignition as he does so. Police officers descend on the stationary vehicle, and after a struggle, finally manage to subdue and detain the fleeing killers. Only 2 hours have passed since they hopped the fence at Carstairs. McCulloch would later plead guilty to the slaying of Ian Simpson, Neil McClellan, and PC George Taylor. Mone pleads guilty only to killing George. and the man he stabbed in the chest survived. Robert Mone's father was an abusive, misogynistic, and drug-addicted recidivist who showed little regard for his son at any time before the killings. That would change for the worse. Once the younger Mone was convicted for his crimes, Sonny would boast to others in the local pubs about being the father of the Carstairs killer. He relished in the sick prestige of that fact. He'd tell people about how he yearned to be reunited with his son, but not in freedom, in prison. On the 29th of December 1979, a mere 2 years after the Carstairs escape, police are notified about the disappearance of 78-year-old Agnes Waugh, Sonny's aunt. She hadn't been seen for 3 days, and other residents of her all-female housing estate had reported that her front door was open and the fire inside was still lit. Officers entered the block with the intention of searching every flat. The only home on the ground floor appeared to be empty. Seeking entrance, they walk outside and force open a window. At the end of the hall, they see a lifeless arm hanging over the edge of the bed. The woman is in her 20s and has stockings and electrical cord wrapped tightly around her neck. She'd been severely beaten. When the officers check the rest of the house, they discover 2 more women in their 70s, tied to chairs with plastic shopping bags, stockings wrapped tightly around their throats, both also severely beaten. The women would later be identified as Agnes Waugh, 70-year-old Jane Simpson, and 29-year-old Catherine Miller. When Sonny is questioned by police, he admits being at the scene of the crime but denies involvement and is released. Forensic pathologists match a triangular-shaped wound on Agnes's cheek to a ring that Sonny always wore, given to him by his son. He's even wearing it when they arrest him. It takes the jury a mere 75 minutes to convict Sonny. He's given a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years to be served. However, 2 years into his sentence at Craiginch's prison in Aberdeen, he's stabbed to death by another inmate. One last twisted thing worth mentioning is that in 1981, Mone's 17-year-old sister, Rose Anna Mone, is charged with attempted murder after using a broken bottle and knife to viciously assault another woman. In the end, the charges were dropped to serious assault, and she's sent to a youth detention centre for 3 years. This isn't an argument for inherited evil. It's simply a stark reminder that those raised within an engine of cyclical violence are so often consumed by it themselves. Robert Mone is Scotland's longest-serving prisoner, still detained at the time of publishing this video. McCulloch was released in 2013, however, and is a free man living in the city of Dundee, despite killing more people than Mone. He successfully argued that his natural life sentence was a violation of his human rights and was given a minimum tariff of 30 years, at which point he'd already served and was released on a life license. Robert Mone's own words in the book Carstairs are remarkably eloquent, yet littered with self-pity and questionable remorse. However, the facts are plain. He had many choices and chances to avoid doing the things he did, and chose to do them anyway. I'm not going to air my feelings on McCulloch, as I imagine you feel the exact same thing I did. And that's the story of the Dundee school siege and the Carstairs escape. This was a tough one to research. The facts are almost unrelentingly bleak and tragic. And what's worse is that many parts of it feel avoidable, that some intervention at some earlier point could have stopped all of it before it happened. But it is what it is, and it was what it was. I really appreciate you spending the time to watch this. I still struggle with motivation and progression, but I am getting better. These videos take a long time to research, write, record, and edit. I don't use any AI in their production. I'm fed up with the low effort slop YouTube seems to be overrun with these days. It feels like every other video is just AI voiceovers and AI scripts with AI video, and it's driving me mental. So if you like this, consider doing all the usual YouTube things. You give me a couple of clicks and some keyboard taps, and I'll keep bringing you high effort, human made content. Thanks for watching. See ya.